She was 10 years old, standing in a repair bay that smelled like curing resin and warm metal. Her father pressed her palm flat against a fiberglass panel, smooth, solid, alive with the heat of the afternoon sun coming through the hangar doors. Strength is not thickness, he said. Strength is layers that know where the force is going. She filed the lesson away the way children file away things they do not yet need. 26 years later, standing inside a hollow white shell in a scrapyard north of Panama City, she needed it. Mara Velez had not slept in a bed in 11 days. She slept in the back of a 2004 Tacoma with her daughter Iris curled against the wheel well, a beach towel folded under both their heads, and the windows cracked 2 inches because Florida in August turned a closed truck cab into a kiln by 6 in the morning. Iris was 8. She had asthma. The mold that crept through every cheap rental in Caligo County sent her into coughing fits that lasted until her ribs ached and her lips went gray. So they slept in the truck on a scrubby half-acre off County Road 41, 4 miles from Heron Cuts Marina, on a sand ridge nobody wanted because no builder would run utilities to a lot that flooded ankle deep in summer thunderstorms. The land had cost almost nothing at tax auction. It had an old concrete equipment pad cracked down the center, 2 pines that leaned like drunks, no septic approval, and an access road the county had abandoned when the last occupant left owing back taxes in 2011. Mara bought it because she could afford it. She could afford almost nothing else. $6,900. That was the number she wrote on the back of an envelope and taped to the truck's sun visor so she could see it every morning and subtract. $4,200 was already spoken for. Land taxes, $840. The truck payment she could not miss without losing the truck, $312 a month. A storage unit holding everything she and Iris owned that would not fit in a pickup bed, $90 a month. Medical bills from Iris's last emergency room visit when the nebulizer ran out of albuterol at 2 in the morning in a motel room thick with mildew, $1,067 on a payment plan. Mara did the subtraction every morning, $2,700 free. Maybe less if something broke. She had been a composites quality control technician at a subcontracting facility near Tyndall Air Force Base. She knew fiberglass. She knew layup schedules and cure temperatures, and the way resin smelled different at 140 degrees than at 160. She knew how to read a laminate under ultraviolet light and find the voids that would become cracks, that would become failures. The facility closed after its 3rd hurricane-related insurance hike in 5 years. Her supervisor told her the company was relocating to a facility outside Huntsville. He did not offer her a position. He offered her a handshake and said, "You were one of the best inspectors I had." Past tense. The compliment arrived in the same sentence as the unemployment. No spouse. Her marriage had ended 3 years earlier when her husband left for a pipeline job in West Texas and stopped answering his phone after the 2nd month. No family in Caligo County. Her father, the man who had taught her to read composite structures by touch, had died of a stroke in 2015. Her mother lived in a nursing facility in Ocala on Medicaid. There was no one to call, no credit score worth presenting to a bank, no safety net except the number on the sun visor that shrank every week. The plan had been simple. Buy the land. Buy a used manufactured home, the kind that sits on a steel frame and gets bolted to the ground with hurricane straps. Move in. Get Iris registered at the elementary school 2 miles down County Road 41. Start work at the marine composite shop in Heron Cut that had posted a help wanted sign in the window since June. Simple. The county denied the plan on a Tuesday afternoon in a cinderblock office that smelled like copier ink and mildew. The clerk's name was Donna. She was not cruel. She was tired. She had processed 37 permit applications that month and denied 19 of them, and the denials wore on her more than the approvals because she knew what they meant. The used trailer Mara had found, a 2009 model listed for $4,800 that she planned to negotiate down to $3,500, had roof damage along the rear seam. It was missing tie-down documentation from its previous installation. It had no proof it could meet the county's current wind load requirements, which had been raised after the last major hurricane chewed through the panhandle and turned cheap trailers into shrapnel. Donna spread the paperwork on the counter and pointed to each deficiency with a pen that had been chewed at the cap. Roof seam compromise. No tie-down engineering. No wind load certification. Any one of these is a denial, she said. You have all three. Mara asked what it would cost to fix them. Donna said a new roof seal and wind load certification would run between $2,000 and $4,000, assuming the frame was sound. If the frame was not sound, the trailer was scrap. $2,000 to $4,000. Mara had $2,700 free. The math did not work. The math had stopped working weeks ago, but this was the moment the numbers became a wall. Then you do not have a house, Donna said, not as a judgment, as a fact. Mara stood outside the county office with the denial notice in her hand and the August heat pressing down like a wet blanket. Iris held a paper lunch sack gone soft from humidity. A deputy walked past, paused, and kept going. Rain began to tap the metal awning above the entrance. Mara folded the denial notice into a perfect square and put it in Iris's backpack, next to the inhaler and a granola bar. She did not cry. She drove back to the lot and parked in the shade of the slash pines and stared at the cracked concrete pad and thought about what Donna had said. Then you do not have a house. Darrell Futch arrived 2 days later without being asked. He was 58, the county building inspector for Caligo County's unincorporated zones, and a former framing contractor who had built houses for 23 years before his knees told him to stop climbing ladders. He drove a white county truck with a clipboard on the passenger seat and a thermos of black coffee wedged between the console and the emergency brake. He knew about Mara's lot because Donna had flagged it. Single mother, child, no permitted dwelling, potential code violation if she kept sleeping in the truck. He walked the lot with the clipboard under his arm and said nothing for 4 minutes. He looked at the concrete pad. He looked at the slash pines. He looked at the truck with the beach towel visible through the rear window. He looked at Iris sitting on the tailgate reading a library book with her knees drawn up. Then he turned to Mara and said, "A house out here needs 3 things before anything else: elevation, load path, and a roof that does not peel like a sardine can." He pointed to the concrete pad. "That slab was poured for equipment. Nobody engineered it for a dwelling. It might hold. It might crack worse than it already has under the first real wind event." He pointed to the truck. "That is not a home. That is a health violation with a child inside." He pointed east toward the Gulf. "You have maybe 6 weeks before the Gulf remembers us. Maybe less." Mara asked him what a code-compliant manufactured home would cost, delivered and tied down. Darrell said at least $58,000. A tiny site-built shell, stripped to bare studs with no finish work, would run more than $30,000 before plumbing. A shipping container conversion, the option every internet forum recommended, sounded cheaper until you priced the transport, the cutting, the insulation to prevent condensation in Florida humidity, and the foundation work. $15,000 minimum, and that assumed donated labor. Mara had less than $2,700 truly free. The gap was not a gap. It was a canyon. "You cannot engineer your way around having no money," Darrell said. He was not being mean. He was being accurate. He had seen this before. People with good intentions and empty accounts trying to will a house into existence on land that resisted habitation. Most of them ended up back in rental units they could not afford, owing money on land they could not use. Mara did not argue with him. She asked him a different question. What fails first in a hurricane? Darrell looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, Usually the roof. The wind gets under an edge, lifts it, and once the envelope is breached, the house is done. Then the openings. Windows blow in or get hit by debris, wind enters, pressure builds inside, and the walls push out. Then everything inside becomes weather. He paused. Why? Mara said, Because if I know what fails, I know what not to build. Darrell shook his head. He wrote something on his clipboard. He told her she had 30 days to establish a permitted dwelling or vacate the lot, and if Iris was still sleeping in the truck when he came back, he would have to file a referral. He was not threatening her. He was telling her the rules he was required to enforce, and the telling cost him something because he could see the library book on Iris's knees and the inhaler clipped to her backpack strap. He left. Mara stood on the cracked concrete pad with the inspection notice in her hand, and the sun white and heavy above the pines. She had 30 days. $2,700. A daughter who could not breathe in mold. No roof, no walls, no house. But she had heard a problem stated in a language she understood. Failure points. Sequence of collapse. The roof goes first, then the openings. Then the interior becomes weather. What if there was no separate roof to peel? What if the whole structure was one continuous skin? She did not have the answer yet, but she had the question, and the question would not let go. The scrapyard sat north of Panama City on a county road lined with saw palmetto and rusted chain link. Mara went there for a day labor shift inventorying damaged composite parts, a job that paid $11 an hour cash under a foreman who did not ask questions as long as you could tell fiberglass from carbon fiber by touch. The yard held the carcasses of things the Gulf Coast had used up and thrown away, boat hulls with their keels split, damaged radar domes, sections of industrial pipe scorched by chemical fires, a collapsed cooling tower panel warped like a potato chip, and behind the far fence, lying in weeds that had grown knee-high around it, a cut section of a decommissioned wind turbine blade. It was white, dirty white, scuffed and streaked with bird droppings, and the pale green of algae that grows on anything left outside in Florida long enough. It was enormous. 150 feet of engineered composite, cut into transportable sections when the turbine it belonged to was decommissioned from a wind farm that never produced what the investors promised. The root section, the wide end that had once bolted to the turbine hub, gaped open like the mouth of something marine and ancient. The yard owner wanted it gone. He had been trying to dispose of it for 7 months. Fiberglass blades could not be recycled without specialized grinding equipment that cost more than the material was worth. Landfills charged by volume, and a turbine blade section had a lot of volume. He had called 3 scrap dealers. None of them wanted to pay for the crane time to move it. The blade sat behind the fence and gathered algae and cost him nothing except the space it occupied and the irritation of looking at it. Mara walked past it on her lunch break. She stopped. She looked at it the way she had looked at composite panels on the inspection line, not at the surface, but at the structure. The shell was a sandwich. She knew this without cutting it open because she had read the spec sheets years ago. Balsa or foam core between glass fiber reinforced polymer face sheets, bonded with epoxy structural adhesive. The same architecture that made boat hulls strong and light. The same architecture that let a 150-foot blade flex in gale force wind without snapping. She stepped through the root opening with her phone flashlight on. The interior was hollow, ribbed with structural webs that ran the blade's length like the bones inside a whale's fin. The root section was just under 12 feet in diameter at the widest point. She could stand upright with room to spare. The walls curved overhead in a continuous arc, no ridge, no peak, no flat plane for wind to catch and peel. She pressed her palm against the inner shell. It was warm from the sun. It was smooth. It was strong. She tapped it with her knuckle. The sound was dense, not the hollow ring of a barrel, the muted thud of layers doing their job. Her father's voice arrived without warning. She was 10 years old, standing in the Tyndall repair bay while he pressed her palm against a fiberglass panel. "Strength is not thickness," he had said. "Strength is layers that know where the force is going." Mara stood inside the turbine blade and did the calculation that would change everything. The first 38 feet of the root section had enough interior volume for a narrow living bay. Not a house. A pod. A shelter with curved walls, no separate roof, no flat surface for wind to grip, and a shell designed to negotiate air moving at speeds that would strip shingles off every conventional roof in Caligo County. The tapering section beyond the living bay could become sealed storage, water tanks, a storm-safe crawl passage. The whole structure sat low and could be anchored to the ground like a vessel instead of a building, bolted down, strapped, tied into the earth so it could not roll, could not lift, could not become the debris that killed the people inside. She chalked a line on the interior where a door could go on the leeward side. Then she stopped, because every cut in a composite shell was a weakness, and she would have to earn each opening with reinforcement. She paid the yard owner $100 for the blade section. He looked at her as if she had offered to buy his garbage, which she had. He wrote a receipt on the back of an invoice and said, "It's yours if you can move it." Moving it was the real cost. $600 for a lowboy trailer rental. $300 for a crane operator who owed a favor to the yard foreman and called it even at cash price. Every remaining dollar would go to steel saddles, hurricane straps, marine sealant, salvaged windows, vents, and hardware. The budget did not have room for a single mistake. The blade arrived on her lot on a Thursday morning. The lowboy blocked County Road 41 for 20 minutes, while the crane set the root section onto temporary cribbing on the concrete pad. Cars slowed, trucks stopped. A teenager in a lifted Silverado filmed the whole thing on his phone and posted it with a caption that read, "Lady bought a spaceship." Mara stood beside the white shell with Iris holding her hand. The blade was scratched and dented from transport. It looked like wreckage. It looked like a mistake. But Mara saw the curve. She saw the continuous skin. She saw a structure with no ridge for wind to split, no flat face to catch pressure, no seam where a roof met a wall, because there was no roof and there was no wall. There was only the shell, and the shell was one piece. Iris looked up at her mother and said, "Is this our house?" Mara said, "Not yet." Lena Oryx saw the delivery from her produce stand a quarter-mile down County Road 41. She was 42, practical in the way that people who have lost things become practical. Her husband had died in a shrimping accident 4 years earlier, and she ran the roadside stand because the boat insurance paid off the trailer but did not pay for groceries. She lived in a double wide that she had tied down herself after the second storm peeled back her neighbor's carport and sent it through her kitchen window. She knew what wind could do because she had the scar on her forearm where the glass had cut her while she covered her son's face. Lena walked over that evening carrying a bag of tomatoes and a look that Mara recognized as concern dressed up as curiosity. "What is that?" Lena asked, pointing at the blade section. "Turbine blade," Mara said. "Wind turbine, decommissioned." "And you're going to do what with it?" "Live in it." Lena set the tomatoes on the tailgate and crossed her arms. "Mara, that thing was made to spin in the air, not raise a child." The debate lasted 20 minutes and covered every objection a practical person could raise. Lightning. The blade had no metal skin, but Mara would need a grounding system. Heat. A sealed composite shell in Florida sun would cook anything inside without proper ventilation. Mold. The same enemy that had driven them from every rental. Bathroom drainage. You could not run plumbing through a curved wall without custom fittings. And the question Lena returned to 3 times. What happens if the thing rolls? Mara answered each one, not with theory, with action. She pulled a carpenter's level from the truck bed and set it on the root section. She showed Lena the chalk marks where the steel saddles would cradle the shell. She drew the helical piles in the sand with a stick, steel screws drilled below the surface to anchor the saddles to something deeper than sand. She showed where the door would be recessed into the shell's curve, where the vents would dogleg so rain could not drive straight in, where the interior ribs would distribute any load that hit the exterior. Lena listened. She asked questions that proved she was listening. She picked up the carpenter's level and set it back down. You have sketches, Lena said. You do not have proof. I know, Mara said. And you're betting your daughter on sketches. Mara did not answer that one. There was nothing to say that would make it sound less terrifying than it was. She was betting Iris on a discarded industrial object, a set of skills she had used to inspect other people's work, but never to build her own, and $2,000 that had to cover every material between here and livable. Lena left the tomatoes and walked home. She did not say good luck. She said, I will check on you tomorrow, which meant more than luck because it meant she would be watching, and watching was the first step toward helping or the first step toward calling someone who could take Iris somewhere safer. The risk calculation kept Mara awake that night in the truck bed with Iris breathing shallow beside her. If she cut the door opening wrong, the shell could delaminate, layers separating at the edge, propagating cracks that would weaken the whole section. If she anchored wrong, the pod could become debris in the first serious wind event, not a shelter, but a projectile. If she sealed it too tightly against mold and moisture, the interior would trap heat and humidity until the air became its own health threat. If she opened it too much for ventilation, wind and rain would find a path inside. The turbine blade was not a magic object. It was a material with advantages that only worked if Mara respected every way it could fail. The curve was strong because it distributed load, but a curve with a bad cut was weaker than a flat panel with a good joint. The composite was light because the layers shared the work, but layers that delaminated shared nothing. She stared at the white shell in the dark. It glowed faintly under the quarter moon. She could hear Iris's breath catch and release, catch and release. Tomorrow she would start cutting, and every cut would either prove she understood what her father taught her or prove that Lena was right. The blade became Heron Cut's entertainment before it became anything else. Men slowed their trucks on County Road 41. Some stopped entirely, engines idling, windows down, elbows out. They looked at the white shell on the concrete pad the way people look at wreckage, part curiosity, part pity, part relief that it was someone else's problem. Teenagers filmed it. Someone wrote "space tube" in blue chalk near the root end. A thunderstorm washed the letters pale, but did not erase them. Troy Pallison heard about the blade before he saw it. He was 49, the owner of Pallison Salvage, and an informal land speculator who understood Caligo County's land values the way a poker player understands odds, not from charts, but from watching what people needed and what they would give up to get it. Troy had wanted Mara's lot, not for the lot itself, which was scrub and sand, but because 3 adjacent parcels, including hers, could be bundled and sold to an out-of-town developer once the county approved a road improvement grant that would bring utilities within reach. Mara's refusal to sell had cost him leverage. He did not forget that. Troy's interest in Mara's failure was not personal in the way cruelty is personal. It was structural. If she failed, got cited, or abandoned the land, the lot would revert to delinquent status and he could acquire it at the next auction. Her success cost him money. Her failure gave him a parcel. At the bait shop off the marina, Troy leaned against the freezer case and said, "She bought herself a dead airplane wing and called it a house." The line was good. It spread because it was funny and because it sounded true. People repeated it at the gas station, at the hardware store, at the VFW post where men who had survived 3 hurricane seasons drank beer and compared roof patches. A local Facebook post called the blade "the rich woman's trash coffin," which was doubly wrong because Mara was not rich and the blade was not a coffin, but accuracy had never been a requirement for local commentary. The confrontation came at the hardware store on a Saturday morning. Mara was buying stainless steel screws, 1 box at a time because she could only afford 1 box at a time. She stood at the register counting out bills and coins while the clerk ran the scanner. Troy appeared behind her in line. He was taller than her by 6 inches and wider by the kind of bulk that came from lifting things for a living and eating what he pleased. He picked up the box of screws from the counter and read the label aloud. Number 10 stainless, 1 1/4 inch, 36 count. He set the box down. "You planning to screw the whole hurricane down with that?" The clerk laughed. A short, involuntary sound. He caught himself and looked away. Mara did not turn around. She said, "I also need 2 rolls of butyl tape, 2 tubes of marine sealant, and the cheapest hearing protection you have in a child's size." Troy's smile flattened. He had expected a reaction. Anger, tears, an argument he could win in front of witnesses. Instead, he got a supply list. Mara paid, took the bag, and walked past him without making eye contact. Not because she was afraid, because she did not have time to be angry at someone who was not the hurricane. But Troy's mockery had consequences beyond his voice. Iris heard other children at the library summer program call the pod The Tube. She came home quiet and would not say why until Mara found the library book face down under the truck seat, and Iris said, "They said we live in garbage." Mara held her daughter on the tailgate and said nothing for a long time because there was no sentence that could make an 8-year-old understand that garbage was a matter of engineering, not appearance. Lena stopped bringing vegetables for 4 days. Not because she agreed with Troy, because she was embarrassed to be associated with the insulated. In a small town, proximity was endorsement, and Lena could not afford to be the woman who supported the woman who lived in a tube. Daryl sent a formal notice requiring a site inspection before any occupancy. The notice was not Troy's doing directly, but Troy had filed an anonymous complaint to the county code enforcement line alleging that a child was being housed in an unpermitted industrial object. The complaint triggered the inspection requirement. The inspection gave Mara a deadline she could not negotiate. Troy had turned mockery into paperwork, and paperwork in Caligo County had teeth. Mara began cutting the next morning before dawn. She woke at 4:45 and left Iris sleeping in the truck. The air was already heavy. August in the Panhandle did not cool overnight. It merely paused, gathering heat for the next day like a debt collecting interest. The white blade shell was damp with condensation. Mara wiped the area around her first chalk mark with a rag and stood with the oscillating saw in her hand for a full minute before she pressed the trigger. The first cut was the door, the leeward side, as she had planned. She cut slowly because fiberglass punished impatience. Too fast and the blade grabbed. Too much pressure and the laminate chipped and delaminated at the edge. She had watched technicians ruin perfectly good panels by rushing. She would not rush. The saw whined through the outer skin, then the core, then the inner skin. Dust rose in a pale cloud that caught the first light. She wore a respirator and safety glasses and the cheapest hearing protection from the hardware store. The dust stuck to her sweat. By the time the door opening was roughed out, her arms were white to the elbows and her wrists ached. Fiberglass dust was the enemy she knew best. Microscopic glass needles that embedded in skin, irritated lungs, and turned every surface into sandpaper. She taped plastic sheeting over the truck windows to keep Iris sealed away during cutting days. She wet sanded when she could because water trapped the dust. She changed respirator filters twice a day and still felt the itch in her throat by evening. The door opening was 26 inches wide and 68 inches tall. She had to crouch slightly to enter because making it taller meant cutting into a structural rib. Every inch of opening was an inch of strength removed. She reinforced the edges with fiberglass tape and epoxy, materials she had taken from the scrapyard in exchange for 2 extra hours of inventory work. The layup was not pretty. It was functional. She pressed each strip with a roller and checked the bond with her fingernail the way her father had taught her, feeling for the tacky spot that meant the resin had not cured, the hard ridge that meant an air bubble trapped between layers. The physical toll arrived on the 3rd day. Blisters opened on both palms where the saw vibrated through her gloves. Her right wrist swelled from the repetitive cutting motion. She wrapped it with an elastic bandage from the dollar store and kept working because the calendar did not care about her wrist. 6 weeks until hurricane season's statistical peak. Daryl's inspection in less than 4 weeks. Troy's complaint ticking in the county system like a slow fuse. Iris adapted the way children adapt to circumstances they cannot control, by making the uncontrollable into a game. She counted screws into muffin tins and labeled them by size with a marker. She drew floor plans on scrap cardboard, each version more elaborate than the last, with features the pod could never hold: a bathtub, a second floor, a room for a dog they did not have. She taped the drawings to the inside of the truck cap and asked Mara each evening which plan was best. Mara always chose the one with the dog. The first setback came during a late afternoon thunderstorm in the 2nd week. Mara was inside the pod sealing a vent penetration when rain arrived sideways, and the wind gusted hard enough to shake the shell. She felt it move. Not much, half an inch, maybe less. But she felt the cribbing, the temporary wooden supports holding the blade off the concrete pad, sink into saturated sand on the leeward side. The blade shifted, and the carpenter's level she had left on the interior floor rolled 2 inches before stopping against a rib. Half an inch, on a structure that weighed thousands of pounds, in an ordinary thunderstorm. Not a hurricane, not a tropical storm. A Thursday afternoon squall that barely made the weather radar. Lena had been right. A curved shell could roll if it was treated like a house instead of a vessel. Mara stood in the rain with one hand on the blade and felt the shell vibrate under her palm. Inside the truck, Iris slept through it, her breath fogging the window. The image was terrifying in its specificity. If the pod shifted in a real storm, it would not shift half an inch. It would roll. And if Iris was inside when it rolled, the curved wall that Mara trusted to protect her daughter would become the thing that crushed her. She could not afford the anchoring she needed. She had spent almost everything on transport, hardware, and sealant. The helical piles she had described to Lena, the steel screws that would tie the saddles to deep ground, cost more than she had left. Without them, the blade was not a shelter. It was a threat. The money was gone. The clock was running. The blade sat on wet sand in the dark, and Mara Velez had no idea how to keep it from killing the one person she had built it to save. Tell us in the comments, have you ever been doubted by someone who could only see what was missing, not what you were building? But the answer came the way answers sometimes come in small towns where people watch more than they speak. It came from Lena Orwick, standing in Mara's lot the next morning with her arms crossed and her phone in her hand. "I called someone," Lena said. "I still think this is strange, but strange is not the same as stupid." She had called Dr. Nomi Sato, and Nomi Sato was already on her way. Doctor, Nomi Sato arrived in a rust-colored Subaru with a limp and a habit of touching things before she spoke about them. She was 64. She had designed composite racing hulls for a naval architecture firm in Pensacola for 21 years before a yard accident, a jig clamp failure that dropped a hull mold on her left leg, ended her career on the production floor and started a second one consulting from a home office 2 towns over. She wore canvas shoes, carried a canvas bag full of tools that clinked when she set it down, and the first thing she did on Mara's lot was ignore Mara entirely. Nomi walked to the blade. She pressed her palm flat against the outer skin near the root and held it there for 10 seconds. She ran her hand along the curve, stopped at a scuff mark, and rubbed it with her thumb. She crouched. The limp made this slow and deliberate, and looked at the temporary cribbing, the sand displacement, and the chalk marks Mara had drawn on the concrete pad. She stood and walked the full length of the blade section, her hand trailing along the surface as if reading Braille. She stopped where the taper narrowed past the living bay, tapped it twice with the heel of her hand, and turned to Mara. "You have not cut openings on the windward side," Nomi said. It was not a question. It was an observation. And it was the first thing anyone had said to Mara about the blade that recognized competence instead of questioning sanity. "No," Mara said. "Why not?" "Because wind hits the windward face at full dynamic pressure. Every opening on that side is a breach point. The door is leeward. The vent's dogleg, so driven rain cannot follow a straight path inside." Nomi looked at her for a moment. Then she set her canvas bag on the concrete pad and said, "Show me the rest." Nomi had not come because Lena asked. She had come because Lena described what Mara was doing with enough specificity that Nomi recognized the thinking behind it. A woman living in a truck with a sick child was a social problem. A woman who understood windward loading and vent geometry was an engineering problem. Nomi did not do charity. She did problems. The first lesson happened that afternoon. Nomi set 2 paint cans on the sand, laid a thin scrap board flat across them, and stepped on the center. The board snapped. Then she took a second board of the same thickness, curved it over the paint cans, and stood on it. It held. Her full weight, her bad leg, and her good one. The board flexed, but did not break. "The shape is doing half the work," Nomi said. "Do not cut away the shape that is carrying you." She was talking about the blade's ribs. Mara had planned to remove one interior web to gain 6 inches of floor width in the sleeping area. Nomi showed her that the web was part of the load path, the continuous chain of structure that carried force from the outer skin through the ribs to the saddles to the ground. Remove the web, and the chain had a missing link. The 6 inches of comfort would cost the structure its ability to transfer a broadside gust without buckling. Mara kept the rib. She built the bunk around it instead, using the web as a natural divider between Iris's sleeping space and the narrow galley. The second lesson came 3 days later. Nomi poured a cup of water over the seam where Mara planned to install a salvaged marine window. They watched the water bead hesitate and then creep along the sealant line toward a hairline gap where the curve of the shell met the flat edge of the window frame. "Water is more patient than wind," Nomi said. "Wind hits and moves on. Water finds the lowest point and waits." They redesigned the windows. Instead of flush-mounted frames that relied entirely on sealant, Mara recessed each window into the shell with a raised lip, a dam that water had to climb before it could reach the seal. She added drain channels below each opening, tiny grooves routed into the composite that directed any intrusion outward and down. The work took 2 extra days. Mara could feel the calendar burning. Nomi did not soften the timeline. She said, "A dry shelter that is not finished is better than a finished shelter that leaks. The mold will come for your daughter faster than the storm will." The third lesson was the one that saved everything, and it came from a phone call Nomi made on Mara's behalf. She had an old contact, a man named Ray Purvis, who installed helical piles for commercial signage and cell towers along the Gulf Coast. Nomi called him and described the project in language he understood. A composite shell, approximately 6,000 pounds, needing tie-down to resist overturning in sustained winds above 100 miles per hour. Ray said he could install 6 piles in a day. His normal rate was $280 per pile. For Nomi, he would do it at cost, 6 piles, materials and labor, for $960. $960. Mara had $1,042 left. She would have $82 after the piles. $82 for everything else. She said yes without hesitating because the alternative was a blade that could roll in a squall and kill her daughter. Ray came on a Wednesday with a truck-mounted hydraulic driver and sank 6 7-foot steel helical piles through the sand into the compacted substrate below the concrete pad. The piles went in screaming, a high metallic grinding that scattered birds from the slash pines and brought Iris out of the truck with her hands over her ears. Each pile took 8 minutes. When Ray finished, he grabbed the top of one and pulled. It did not move. The ground held. Mara welded the steel saddles herself. She borrowed a wire-feed welder from Lena's late husband's tool shed and laid beads that were ugly but solid, continuous, no cold starts, no porosity she could find when she ground them smooth and inspected under flashlight. 3 saddles, each one a cradle that hugged the blade's curve with rubber isolation pads between the steel and the composite. Through-bolted bands locked the shell to the saddles. Cross-bracing ran from the saddles to the helical pile caps and back to the concrete pad. When she finished, the blade no longer looked like a discarded object. It looked captured, pinned to the earth, held down by steel and intention. Nomi inspected every connection. She found one cross brace that was 3 degrees off plumb and made Mara cut it and re-weld it. She found a through bolt that was finger tight instead of torqued and made Mara mark every bolt with a witness line, a paint stripe across the bolt head and the saddle so that any rotation would be visible at a glance. "If a bolt turns," Nomi said, "you will see the line break before you feel the shell move. The marks tell you the truth before the structure lies to you." Mara painted white witness lines on every bolt, 36 marks, 36 tiny truths. Progress came in weeks, and each week cost something. Week 1. The blade was leveled on its saddles. Mara shimmed the rubber pads until the carpenter's level read true in both directions. Iris placed the level and announced the readings as if she were a launch controller. The door ring was rough cut, but not yet framed. Week 2. The door ring was framed with fiberglass angle stock that Nomi brought from her garage. Mara laminated reinforcement strips around every edge until the opening was stiffer than the surrounding shell. The first interior foam gaps, where the core had been damaged during transport, were filled with closed-cell spray foam and fared smooth. The pod began to smell like resin and intent. Week 3. The electrical system went in, a small solar panel mounted on a welded bracket above the root end, angled to miss the worst of the afternoon shadows from the slash pines, a deep cycle marine battery in a sealed low cabinet, LED strip lights along the interior ribs, a single outlet for Iris's nebulizer. Mara ran the wiring outside the composite shell in conduit because she refused to drill through the laminate for electrical penetrations. Every hole was a weakness. She was running out of things to give. Week 4. The narrow kitchen came together from salvaged pieces: a marine sink from a scrapped center console boat, a 2-burner propane cooktop that Nomi found at a yard sale for $15, a plywood counter that Mara sealed with 3 coats of polyurethane because she could not afford marine varnish. The composting toilet enclosure went into the taper section behind a privacy curtain made from a canvas drop cloth. It was not dignity, it was function. Week 5. The air exchange vents were installed. This was the work that frightened Mara most because ventilation in a sealed composite shell was the difference between breathable air and a coffin. She cut 2 vent openings on opposite sides of the root section, each one a 4-inch diameter penetration reinforced with fiberglass collars. The vents dog-legged, angled channels that allowed air to pass but prevented rain from driving straight in. A passive stack vent ran through an existing service port at the top of the root, creating a thermal draw that pulled warm air out and cool air in through the lower vents. She tested it by lighting a stick of incense inside the pod and watching the smoke. The smoke drifted toward the stack vent, curled upward, and vanished. Air was moving. Mara sat on the floor and breathed. The physical toll was visible now. Mara had lost 8 pounds. Her right wrist swelled enough that she wore the elastic bandage continuously and took ibuprofen 3 times a day. Her hands were cross-hatched with small cuts from fiberglass edges. She fell asleep at 8:30 every night and woke at 4:45 every morning, and the hours between were not enough. Iris's asthma flared during the sanding phase. Despite the plastic sheeting, despite the wet sanding, despite the respirator Mara wore, fiberglass dust migrated. It settled on surfaces. It found its way into the truck cab. Iris woke coughing at 2 in the morning, and the coughing did not stop until Mara held the nebulizer mask to her face for 20 minutes in the dark. The next day, Mara stopped all sanding work and spent 2 days taping plastic over every interior surface and wiping down the truck interior with damp rags until her arms shook. 2 days lost. Troy used them. He told Daryl the child was already getting sick. He said it with the voice of concern. He said it standing outside the hardware store where 2 other men could hear him. "That girl is breathing fiberglass dust. Someone should do something before it is too late." The words sounded like compassion. They functioned like a weapon. Daryl came for the inspection on a Friday afternoon. He walked the lot with his clipboard and his thermos, and his face set in the expression of a man doing a job he did not enjoy. He touched the steel saddles. He looked at the helical pile caps. He opened the door, which now swung on stainless hinges and sealed against a rubber gasket, and stepped inside. He stood in the center of the pod for a long time. The curved walls arched over his head. The LED strips glowed warm along the ribs. The bunk was built tight against the structural web. The galley was narrow but complete. The composting toilet enclosure was hidden behind the canvas curtain. The air smelled clean, resin, wood, and the faint salt of the Gulf carried in through the vent stack. He admitted the anchoring was better than he expected. He said that out loud, and it cost him something to say it, because he had told Mara she could not engineer her way around having no money, and the saddles and piles were engineering of a kind he recognized. Then he found 3 problems. No certified egress window. The marine hatches Mara had installed did not meet the code specification for emergency exit because they were too small and too high. Questionable ventilation volume. The vent stack worked, but Daryl was not sure the total air exchange met the minimum for a sleeping space. Unapproved gray water handling, the kitchen sink drained into a bucket. Mara's face went white. $142 left. 3 violations. Any one of them could condemn the project. Nomi was there. She stood in the doorway with her arms folded and her weight on her good leg. She did not rescue Mara. She waited. Mara proposed solutions. A second hatch at the taper end. She could cut an opening and install a hatch large enough for egress if she reinforced the edges the way she had done the door. A passive vent boost through an existing service port that would increase the air exchange without cutting new holes. A sealed gray water tote. A 20-gallon container with a screw lid for temporary occupancy until she could afford a proper gray line. Daryl listened. He wrote on his clipboard. He said, "This is still not a house." Nomi said, "Then call it an emergency accessory shelter until she can afford the rest." Daryl looked at Nomi. He looked at Mara. He looked at Iris sitting on the bunk with her library book and her inhaler clipped to her backpack. He did not approve occupancy, but he gave Mara 10 days to correct the 3 violations instead of condemning the project and ordering the blade removed. 10 days. Not a victory, a reprieve. After he left, Mara sat on the steel saddle outside the pod with the inspection notice in her hand. Inside, Iris slept. The light through the recessed hatch made a soft oval on the bunk. Mara's hands were shaking. Then Lena came. She walked up the access road carrying 2 used marine hatches, a box of stainless steel hinges, and a bundle of aluminum hurricane shutters that had belonged to her late husband. She set them on the concrete pad next to the saddle where Mara sat. "I still think this is strange," Lena said. "But strange is not the same as stupid." The hatches were the right size. The shutters would protect the windows. The hinges were marine-grade stainless, worth $60 new. Lena did not say where the money came from. She did not need to. The produce stand could not have paid for them. That evening, the weather radio on Mara's truck dashboard named a tropical depression forming in the southwestern Caribbean. Tropical Depression 14. It was not a hurricane yet. It was not even a storm yet. But the water it sat on was bathwater warm, and the atmosphere above it had nothing to stop its growth. Mara finished the egress hatch in 3 days. She boosted the ventilation in 1. She sealed the gray water tote and mounted it under the galley counter with cargo straps. Daryl came back, inspected in silence, and signed the temporary emergency occupancy permit with conditions. No expansion without engineering review. No additional cuts in the shell. Mandatory evacuation compliance if the county ordered it. He handed her the signed form and said, "I hope you never need to test this." Mara and Iris slept inside the pod that night. Rain came after midnight, a normal thunderstorm, the kind that hit 3 times a week in September. Rain struck the shell as a soft hiss, not the hammering of sheet metal, not the drumming of shingles. A hiss like someone running a hand across fabric. The interior stayed dry. The humidity gauge read 57%. The temperature held several degrees cooler than the outside air because the white shell reflected the sun and the composite sandwich slowed heat transfer like a thermos wall. Iris slept through the whole storm. Mara lay awake and listened. She put her palm flat against the curved wall and felt rain and wind translated into vibration so faint it was almost imaginary. A cup of water on the galley counter trembled during the gusts. It did not slide. Then the Caribbean remembered its name. Tropical Depression. 14 became Tropical Storm Meridian on a Sunday. The first track cone put landfall somewhere west of Mobile. Heron Cut exhaled. Troy joked at the marina that Mara had built a storm toy for a storm that would miss. 2 days later, the second advisory shifted the cone east. Pensacola was in the crosshairs. Hardware store shelves thinned. Plywood disappeared first, then tarps, then batteries, then water. The third advisory moved the cone again. Landfall now projected for the stretch of coast between Panama City and Apalachicola. Caligo County sat dead center. No one was joking now. Meridian was not merely strengthening, it was organizing with the efficiency of something that had found its purpose. The eye tightened. The pressure dropped. By Tuesday evening, the National Hurricane Center upgraded Meridian to a major hurricane. Category 3. By Wednesday morning, it was a strong Category 4, and the models suggested it might not stop there. Nomi came to the lot one last time. She moved through the pod the way she had moved through it on her first visit, touching everything, reading the structure with her hands. She made Mara rehearse shutdown, seal the lower vents to half-open position to balance pressure without letting debris inside, lock both hatches and engage the storm shutters. Move the battery bank into the low cabinet and strap it down. Strap Iris's medicine case, the nebulizer, the albuterol cartridges, the backup inhaler, the liquid prednisone under the bunk where nothing could fall on it. Check every saddle bolt, photograph the witness marks. Nomi's hands shook slightly when she checked the last bolt. Mara saw it and said nothing. "The blade is not what saves you," Nomi said. "The habits save you." She left that evening to stay with her son in Tallahassee. At the door, she turned and put her hand on the shell one more time. She did not say goodbye. She said, "Read the force." Then she climbed into her rust-colored Subaru and drove north on County Road 41, and the taillights disappeared around the curve past Lena's stand. That night, the forecast jumped. Meridian crossed the threshold into Category 5. Sustained winds near 160 miles per hour. Storm surge projections climbed. The two-lane road north of Heron Cut jammed with evacuation traffic moving at the speed of fear, which was fast in the heart and slow on the asphalt. Mara planned to leave at dawn with Lena. They would caravan north, Iris in Mara's truck, Lena's son in Lena's truck, and put 200 miles between themselves and the coast before landfall. At 5:30 in the morning, Mara turned the key. The starter clicked once, then nothing. She turned it again. Click. She checked the battery terminals. Clean. She checked the fuse box, intact. She turned the key a third time, and the starter did not even click. The truck was dead. Something in the electrical system had failed in the night. A relay, a solenoid, a connection corroded by salt air and months of sleeping in a parking lot. Lena's truck was full. Her son, her son's girlfriend, 3 bins of irreplaceable photographs, a box of medications, and a cooler of food. She could take Iris. She could not take Mara and Iris and the medicine case and the nebulizer and everything Mara needed to keep her daughter breathing through a 72-hour evacuation in a shelter packed with strangers and mold. Lena said, "Leave the truck. Get in." Mara looked at the truck. She looked at the pod. She looked at the road north, already clogged, the low section near mile marker 7 already pooling with water from the morning's rain bands. She looked at the sky, which was the color of an old bruise, green-gray, pressing down, the air so heavy it felt like breathing through wet cloth. She made the decision in less than a minute. "Take Iris," she said. Iris said no. She said it without screaming, without crying. She said it the way a child says something they have decided, the way adults decide things, with the weight of the body behind the word. She held Mara's hand and said, "No." Mara looked at her daughter and saw something she had not expected. Not fear, certainty. Iris had watched every cut, every weld, every bolt, every witness mark. She had counted the screws. She had drawn the floor plans. She had slept inside the shell and heard the rain become a whisper. She trusted the pod because she had watched it get built, and she would not leave it. Mara sent Lena away. She watched the truck disappear north. Then she took Iris inside the pod and began shutdown. Hurricane Meridian did not arrive as a single event. It arrived as a sequence. and the sequence was a lesson in the difference between what people imagined a hurricane to be and what it actually was. Morning came gray and wrong. The sky had no depth, just a flat ceiling the color of concrete pressing down on the pine tops. The wind was steady from the east, not gusting, just leaning. The slash pines bent and held. Birds were gone. The silence between wind sounds was the kind of silence that meant everything that could leave had left. By 10 in the morning, the rain moved sideways, not falling, traveling. Sheets of water crossing the lot like curtains being pulled across a stage. The pod's shell hissed. Mara checked the seams. Dry. She checked the vent stack. Drawing air. She checked Iris, who sat on the bunk reading a library book with the focus of someone who has decided to be somewhere else. By noon, the first transformer blew. A deep thump and a flash of blue-green light visible through the recessed hatch. The power was gone. The pod had never been on the grid, so the loss was abstract. Mara's solar battery was charged, the LED strips worked, the nebulizer had power. But the loss of the grid meant the loss of the cell network within the hour. The last message Mara sent was to Lena. "We are inside. Pod is holding." Lena replied, "Praying." Then the signal died. The complication arrived at 1 in the afternoon. A neighbor 3 lots east had a generator running under a carport. The generator exhaust mixed with rain and wind and drifted west toward Mara's lot. Iris smelled it first. Her breathing changed. The catch in her inhale that Mara knew was the first sign of a spasm. Mara closed the intake vent to keep the exhaust out, and the humidity inside the pod began to climb within 10 minutes. 58%, 62, 67. She remembered Nomi's voice. A sealed shelter can become its own danger. She reopened the leeward dogleg vent by 1 notch, not enough to let exhaust in, enough to let moisture out. The humidity steadied at 64%. Iris's breathing eased. The margin between safe air and dangerous air was 1 notch on a vent she had built herself. By 2 in the afternoon, Meridian's outer eye wall was over Heron Cut. The wind did not howl. That was the first lie the movies told. The wind roared, a low, continuous, pressurized sound like standing inside an engine. The pod vibrated, not rattled. Vibrated. The whole shell hummed at a frequency Mara could feel in her teeth and her spine. She pressed her palm against the wall and felt the force moving through the composite, not fighting the shell, but flowing around it, the way water flows around a stone in a creek. The first test was anchoring. A gust hit broadside. Mara felt the pod lurch, a tiny movement, and then the steel bands and saddles caught. The rubber pads compressed and released. Compressed and released. The piles held. The shell stayed. The second test was water. Rain found 1 seam near the service hatch at the top of the root, a seam Mara had sealed twice, but where the thermal cycling of Florida sun had opened a hairline gap. Water did not pour. It wept. A thin line of moisture crept along the interior curve. Mara grabbed the pre-cut butyl strips she had stored in the utility cabinet and pressed them into the seam with the heel of her hand while Iris held the flashlight steady. The weeping stopped. Her palm was wet. Her heart was hammering. The third test was debris. At 2:30, a branch struck the marine hatch on the windward side. The impact was sharp and loud enough that Iris dropped the flashlight. The outer acrylic layer of the hatch starred, a web of cracks radiating from the impact point. But Lena's hurricane shutter was between the world and the glass. The shutter dented. The hatch cracked. The seal held. Nothing entered. The fourth test was the hardest, and it had nothing to do with engineering. Between impacts, the interior of the pod became almost silent. The composite shell dampened sound so effectively that the roaring world outside became a muffled drone, and in the silence between gusts, Mara could hear nothing. She could not tell what was being destroyed. She could not tell if Lena's trailer was still standing. She could not tell if the slash pines had fallen. The silence was information denied, and the denial was worse than any sound because it left her imagination to fill the gaps. Iris put her hands over her ears during the worst gusts, not because the sound inside was loud, but because the vibration traveled through her body and she could feel the storm in her bones. Outside, Heron Cut was failing the way Daryl had said houses fail. Lena's double wide lost its skirting first. The aluminum panels ripped away like wrapping paper. Then the porch roof lifted at the windward edge, peeled back in a single sheet, and wrapped itself around a telephone pole 60 feet away. The interior of the porch was open to the sky, and the wind found the hole and pushed. Daryl's workshop, a stick-built outbuilding behind his house, lost its roof at the ridge. The plywood sheathing separated from the trusses along a line exactly where the nailing schedule changed from 6 inches to 12. He had inspected other people's nailing schedules for 15 years. He had never checked his own. Troy's storage shed, a corrugated metal structure behind Pallison Salvage, collapsed at 3 in the afternoon. Troy had refused to move the loose roofing sheets stacked against the south wall because moving them meant admitting the shed might not hold. The sheets became projectiles. One of them punched through a neighbor's wall at chest height. The neighbor was in the hallway. The sheet embedded in the drywall 4 feet from where he had been standing 30 seconds earlier. If you are invested in this story, stay with us, because the next sound Mara heard told her whether the whole town had been wrong or whether she had trapped herself inside her own invention. At 3:45, the sound changed. The roar dropped in pitch and the rain softened, and the light through the hatches shifted from dark gray to a pale, sick yellow. The eye. Meridian's eye was passing over Heron Cut. Mara opened the pod door 2 inches. The world outside was shredded. Pine limbs lay embedded in wet sand at angles that meant they had been flying, not falling. The access road was a river. Troy's shed was gone, just the concrete slab and a few bolts sheared at the base. Lena's porch roof was visible wrapped around the telephone pole 3 lots north. The air smelled like pine sap, salt, ozone, and something chemical. Maybe transformer fluid, maybe gasoline from a ruptured tank. The white blade shell was scratched and dented. The leeward side had 3 impact marks from flying debris. The steel saddles were scoured clean of paint where wind-driven sand had blasted them. But the shell sat in its cradle. The witness marks on every bolt were aligned. The blade had not shifted. Then Daryl's voice from somewhere east. "Creed! Creed, answer me." Mr. Ansel Creed was 76 and lived alone in a concrete block house he believed had survived worse. He had refused evacuation because he had survived 2 previous hurricanes in that house, and he did not believe the third would be different. His windows were protected by plywood he had cut himself and nailed with 8-penny nails instead of screws. 1 sheet of plywood had failed. Wind entered through the opening and pressurized the interior. The pressure found the ceiling and pushed upward. The roof joist separated from the wall plate. The ceiling collapsed in the hallway. Mara heard Daryl shouting. She could not help. The eye would pass. The backside would come. Anyone outside when the wind returned would die. She closed the door. She held Iris. The eye lasted 17 minutes. Then the roar returned from the opposite direction, and it was worse because hope had already entered. The backside of a hurricane carries the same force from the opposite quarter, and the structures that survived the front side are now weakened, opened, compromised. Lena's trailer lost its main roof during the backside. Daryl's workshop, already roofless, lost its east wall. A tree that had bent east now bent west, and the root ball lifted 2 feet out of the ground before the trunk snapped. Inside the pod, Iris began coughing. The humidity had crept up while the vent was closed during the eye. Mara turned on the nebulizer. The battery indicator dropped. She had charged it fully that morning, but the LED lights, the flashlight charging, and now the nebulizer were drawing it down. The machine needed 20 minutes to deliver a full treatment. The battery had maybe 40 minutes of total power left. She turned off the LED strips. The pod went dark except for the green light of the nebulizer and the pale glow through the cracked hatch. She chose Iris. She would always choose Iris. The nebulizer ran for 20 minutes. Iris's breathing eased. The battery dropped to a level Mara could not see in the dark. She turned off everything. The last hour of Hurricane Meridian happened in darkness, with Mara sitting on the floor of the pod with her back against the curved wall, feeling the shell vibrate under her spine, counting Iris's breaths. Inhale, exhale. The shell hummed. The wind screamed outside in a voice that had no words. Inhale, exhale. The saddles held. The bolts held. The witness marks held. Mara counted breaths until she lost count and started again. Dawn came the way it comes after a hurricane, not suddenly, not beautifully, but as a slow leak of gray light through air that was still thick with moisture and debris. The wind dropped below 50 miles per hour, then 40, then 30. The roar became a moan. The moan became a whistle. The whistle became wind, ordinary wind, the kind that moved curtains and knocked over trash cans and did not kill people. Mara opened the pod door. The witness marks on every saddle bolt were aligned. The blade had shifted less than a quarter inch at the mark she had painted on the concrete pad, so small that thermal expansion could account for it. The leeward hatch was cracked but sealed. Interior water intrusion from the service hatch seam totaled less than what one towel could absorb. The medicine case was dry. The battery was dead, but everything it had powered had worked when it was needed. The roof had not peeled because there was no roof to peel. The openings had not breached because they were recessed, shuttered, and sealed. The shell had not lifted because it was bolted through steel to piles sunk 7 feet into the earth. The pod had survived because of the blade's continuous curve, the composite sandwich, the site elevation, the anchoring, the protected openings, and the procedures a retired naval architect had made a single mother rehearse until the rehearsal became reflex. Iris stepped out of the pod wearing oversized hearing protection and holding her medicine case in both hands. She looked at the shredded world and then at the white shell and said, "It's still here." It was still there, and they were still inside it. Daryl Futch walked up County Road 41 at 7 in the morning with a pry bar in one hand and his thermos in the other. He had spent the night in his truck because his workshop roof was in the road and the east wall of the workshop was in his yard, and his wife had refused to stay in the house until he checked the trusses above the bedroom. He had not slept. He had a cut on his forearm from pulling Mr. Ansel Creed out of a collapsed hallway during the eye, and the cut was held together with butterfly bandages from a first aid kit he kept behind the truck seat. He walked north because he expected wreckage. He expected to find the white blade section tipped off its cribbing, rolled into the ditch, maybe cracked open, maybe blocking the road. He expected to find Mara Velez standing in the mud next to it, defeated, ready to accept that the thing she had built was not the thing she thought it was. He had his pry bar because he thought he might need to lever open a jammed hatch to get Iris out. He stopped when he saw the blade still in its saddles. He stood in the road for a full 30 seconds. Then he walked to the lot. The access road was ankle-deep in silted water and covered with pine debris. He stepped over a branch the size of his arm and climbed the slight rise to the concrete pad. The pod was scratched. The windward side had 3 dents from flying debris. each one a shallow compression in the composite shell, no deeper than the thickness of a coin. The steel saddles were scoured raw where wind-driven sand had stripped the paint. The leeward hurricane shutter was buckled inward at one corner. The ground around the helical pile caps was washed clear of sand, exposing the steel collars like bones. But the shell was seated. The bands were tight. The bolts were aligned. Mara opened the hatch from inside. She stood in the doorway, with her hair matted and her wrist wrapped in the same elastic bandage she had worn for 6 weeks. Iris appeared behind her, wearing the oversized hearing protection around her neck and holding the medicine case the way other children held stuffed animals. Daryl set the pry bar against the saddle and touched the steel with his free hand. He ran his thumb along the witness mark on the nearest bolt. The white line was unbroken. The bolt had not turned. He said, "I was wrong about one thing." Mara waited. "You were not avoiding the rules. You were chasing the same thing the rules chase, keeping the load connected to the ground." He did not apologize. He did not need to. The statement was an admission calibrated to the precision he respected, specific, technical, and exactly as large as the error it corrected. He had said she could not engineer her way around having no money. She had not engineered around it. She had engineered through it. The distinction mattered. He asked to photograph the anchoring. The County Emergency Management Office was documenting structures that had performed above Eaxby tie-ins during Meridian, and Daryl wanted the saddle detail, the pile caps, the bolt pattern, and the witness marks. Mara let him photograph everything. She pointed out the seam that had wept during the eye wall and the butyl repair she had done in the dark. She showed him the cracked hatch and the dented shutter. She did not hide the failures because the failures were part of the evidence. Daryl took 43 photographs. He did not call the pod a house. He called it the Veles accessory structure in his notes, which was the most generous language his professional vocabulary allowed. People came to the lot that day, not because they loved Mara, because they needed what she knew. Lena arrived first. Her trailer had survived structurally. The main frame held. The tie-downs held. But the porch roof was gone. The skirting was gone. And the windward wall had taken enough rain through a failed window seal that the drywall was already blooming with mold. Green-black mold, the kind that smelled sweet and wrong. The mold would spread in the post-storm humidity. It would reach the ductwork in days. Lena's son had allergies that were not as severe as Iris's asthma, but bad enough that breathing mold spores in a closed trailer would put him in the emergency room if one ever reopened. But before she asked for help, Lena asked to see the pod from the inside. She had never entered it. She had brought hatches and hinges and hurricane shutters, but she had never stepped through the door she had helped make possible. She ducked through the opening and stood in the center of the curved space, and looked up at the ribs arching overhead, and the LED strips, and the bunk built around the structural web, and the galley counter with 3 coats of polyurethane that Mara had applied because she could not afford marine varnish. "It is smaller than I thought," Lena said. Then she put her hand on the wall. She held it there the way Nomi held it, the way Mara's father had taught Mara to hold it. "It is warmer than I thought, too, like it is holding the heat out." "It is," Mara said. "Composite sandwich. Same principle as a cooler wall." Lena looked at the witness marks on the saddle bolts visible through the hatch. She looked at the drain channels under the recessed windows. She looked at the dogleg vents. She did not say she had been wrong. She said, "My west wall is wet through. How do I keep the mold out of the ducts until I can get a crew?" It was the first time Lena had asked Mara for technical advice. The asking was the conversion. Mara walked to Lena's trailer and spent 2 hours sealing the failed window with plastic sheeting and butyl tape. then cutting the ductwork connection on the windward side so air could not carry spores from the wet wall into the rest of the house. She showed Lena how to set up a cross draft with the remaining windows to keep the wet wall drying without pulling moisture deeper inside. Lena followed each step and asked why at each one, not the why of doubt, the why of someone learning a method they intended to remember. A family from the low road came that afternoon. Their name was Paget. The father carried a cooler with his daughter's insulin supply, and the cooler's ice had melted during the 27 hours without power. Insulin degrades above 86 degrees. The post-storm temperature was 91 and climbing. They needed a cool, dry place to store the cooler until they could find ice or a generator. Mara put the insulin cooler inside the pod, against the interior wall where the composite sandwich kept the temperature several degrees below ambient. She wrapped the cooler in a wet towel and aimed the passive vent stack to draw air across it. She did not know if it would be enough. She did what she could with what she understood. By evening, Daryl had sent 4 people to Mara's lot. Not officially. He simply told them, when they asked how the white tube on County Road 41 had survived, "Go ask the woman who built it." He let Mara be the authority because she was. Mara gave away what she knew without hesitation and without system. She told people where to place vents to create cross drafts in damaged structures. She showed them how to seal seams with butyl tape as a temporary measure against rain intrusion. She explained why loose debris mattered more than most people understood. A sheet of corrugated metal was harmless on the ground and lethal at 100 miles per hour. She repeated Daryl's failure sequence like a catechism. The roof goes first, then the openings, then the interior becomes weather. She said one thing that stuck with everyone who heard it. The storm does not care what your house cost. It cares what your connections look like. The measurable comparison traveled through Heron Cut without Mara pushing it. 3 conventional outbuildings within a quarter-mile of the pod had lost roofs. Lena's porch was destroyed. Troy's shed was gone entirely. Daryl's workshop had lost its roof and east wall. Mr. Creed's block house, the one he believed was hurricane-proof, had failed when a single window breach pressurized the interior and separated the roof from the walls. The pod had kept its envelope intact. It had shifted a quarter inch. It had wept at one seam. It had cracked one hatch. It had lost 0 structural connections. Mara did not claim that turbine blades were hurricane-proof. She claimed something narrower and more useful, a continuous curved shell with protected openings, and real anchoring performed better than a cheap roof with weak connections. The lesson was not about the object. The lesson was about the load path. Troy Pallison said nothing for 3 days after Meridian. His shed was gone. The loose roofing sheets he had refused to secure had punched through a neighbor's wall. The neighbor had not pressed charges because hurricane damage was hurricane damage, and everyone was too exhausted to be angry, but the knowledge was public. Troy had created the debris that nearly killed a man. On the 4th day, Troy drove past Mara's lot, slowed, and photographed the blade through his truck window. He did not stop. He did not speak. But the photograph meant something, and Mara saw him take it. Nomi Sato returned 2 days after the storm with fuel cans, a case of water, 2 blue tarps, and a camera better than Daryl's. She walked the pod the way a surgeon reviews an operation, not celebrating what worked, but cataloging what almost did not. She asked Mara what failed. Mara showed her the service hatch seam, the hairline gap that thermal cycling had opened despite 2 rounds of sealant. She showed the cracked hatch acrylic, the dented shutter, the humidity spike when she closed the vent against generator exhaust. She showed the dead battery. Nomi photographed each failure. Then she smiled, not at Mara's discomfort, at Mara's precision. "You are thinking like an engineer under grief and exhaustion," Nomi said. "That is the thing I cannot teach. That is yours. Their relationship shifted after Meridian. Nomi no longer taught as a consultant visiting a project. She taught as a collaborator entering a partnership. They sat under the blade's shade on folding chairs and marked up a notebook Nomi had labeled second shell. Not a second pod, a second set of principles, how to harden an existing structure using the lessons the blade had demonstrated, continuous connections, protected openings, elevated utilities, ventilation that worked under pressure, witness marks that told the truth. Nomi's backstory emerged in fragments during these sessions, the way backstories emerge between people who are working together and have stopped performing for each other. She had been born in Kobe, Japan, and moved to Florida at 11 when her father took a position at a boatyard in Pensacola. She had watched the Kobe earthquake on television in 1995 and recognized the failure patterns, the soft first stories, the rigid upper floors, the connections that transferred force until they didn't. She had spent her career designing hulls that could take wave impact without delaminating, which was the same problem as wind impact on a different axis. The yard accident that ended her production career had also ended her marriage. Her husband could not watch her limp without seeing his own guilt. He had been the one who cleared the jig for use that day, and the guilt corroded the relationship until nothing was left but the limp and the silence. She had rebuilt her life the way she rebuilt hulls: identify the failure, redesign the connection, test under load. One evening, sitting under the blade, Nomi said something that made Mara go quiet. "You remind me of myself after the accident. You're building a shelter, but you are also building proof that you are not the person they said you were." Mara did not answer. She turned a bolt on the saddle that did not need turning and changed the subject to gray water drainage. The disagreement came 2 weeks after Meridian. Mara wanted to add a second vent on the windward side, a small penetration with a reinforced collar to improve airflow during periods when the leeward vent was closed against smoke or debris. Nomi said no. Every penetration weakened the shell. The blade's strength was its continuity. Adding openings was trading structural margin for comfort, and the margin might be needed in the next storm. Mara pushed back. Iris needed better air. The humidity spike during Meridian had triggered a coughing fit that lasted 40 minutes. If the ventilation was not improved, the pod was protecting Iris from wind while exposing her to mold. The argument lasted an hour. Nomi drew cross-sections on the notebook. Mara countered with humidity data she had recorded on the cheap gauge. They raised their voices once. They both stopped. Nomi said, "You are right about the air. I am right about the shell. Find a solution that does not make me wrong." Mara found it. She built a hand-crank ventilation fan mounted inside the existing vent stack, a paddle wheel connected to a bicycle chain mechanism that could boost airflow without cutting a new opening. It was ugly. It worked. Nomi inspected it and said, "That is an engineer's compromise. You gave up beauty to keep both truths." The months after Meridian were the months Mara became someone Heron Cut needed instead of someone Heron Cut mocked. She held Saturday storm clinics on her lot. The name was Lena's. She painted Storm Clinic on a piece of plywood and leaned it against the produce stand. The first Saturday, 3 people came. The second Saturday, 9. By the fourth Saturday, Daryl attended with his clipboard and his thermos, pretending he was only there to ensure no one violated code. He stayed for 2 hours and asked Mara 6 questions about composite shear strength. Lena brought coffee and a thermos the size of a fire extinguisher and set out folding chairs. Nomi demonstrated how to trace water paths with chalk dust, sprinkling powder along a seam and spraying water, watching where the chalk washed and where it stayed dry. The technique was simple enough that anyone could do it on their own roof. Mara showed people how to think in failure sequences instead of failure events. Not "the wind blew my roof off," but The wind found a lifted edge, entered the attic, pressurized the interior, and pushed the sheathing off the trusses. The sequence had steps. The steps could be interrupted. The interruption was the preparation. A man named Dennis Crowder brought photographs of his roof damage and asked why his neighbor's identical house had lost fewer shingles. Mara looked at the photographs and pointed to the ridge vent. Your ridge cap was face-nailed with smooth shanks. Your neighbor's was nailed with ring shank nails. The smooth shanks backed out under vibration before the wind even peaked. By the time the real gusts hit, your ridge was already open. Dennis stared at the photograph. A $2 difference in nail type had cost him $11,000 in roof replacement. He came to every clinic after that. A woman named Grace Ochoa asked how to protect her windows without buying storm shutters she could not afford. Mara showed her how to cut plywood panels with pre-drilled holes that matched lag bolts set permanently into the window frames, a system that could be deployed in 20 minutes when a warning came and stored flat against the garage wall the rest of the year. The total material cost was less than $90. Grace's house had 6 windows, 6 panels, 36 lag bolts. She drilled them herself the following weekend and sent Mara a photograph of each one. If this story reminds you why preparation matters, share it with someone who has ever been told their careful work looked foolish from the outside. 6 months after Meridian, Nomi was diagnosed with an aggressive heart condition. The diagnosis arrived the way diagnoses do, not as a dramatic scene in a hospital, but as a phone call Mara received while she was caulking a window repair on Lena's trailer. Nomi's voice was steady. She said the words the cardiologist had used. She said the timeline the cardiologist had suggested. She said she was not going to be treated as fragile. She kept coming to the lot. She moved slower. She sat more than she stood. She stopped climbing into the pod and instead inspected from a folding chair outside, directing Mara with hand gestures and the occasional sharp correction. Not there, 6 inches higher. You are putting the brace where it is easy to reach, not where the force needs it. Her final major scene was not a hospital bed. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late spring, sitting under the blade shade with Mara, the notebook labeled Second Shell, open between them. Nomi was marking up a page with a drafting pencil worn flat on one side from decades of use. The pencil moved slowly, but the lines were precise. She looked up and said, "Do not teach people to copy the object. Teach them to read the force." Mara nodded. "I am serious," Nomi said. "Someone will look at this pod and think the blade is the secret. The blade is not the secret. The blade is a shape that cooperates with the force. A shipping container can cooperate. A concrete dome can cooperate. Even a flat roof can cooperate if the connections are continuous and the openings are protected. Teach the principle, not the object." Mara said, "I know." "You know here," Nomi said, touching her own temple. "Make sure you know here." She touched her chest. Nomi died on a Saturday in early June, 8 months after Meridian. She died in her home in her bed with her son beside her, and her hand resting on a drafting table that had been moved into her bedroom because she refused to stop working. Mara drove to the house that evening and sat in the driveway for 20 minutes before going inside. Nomi left Mara her field notebooks, 11 spiral-bound books filled with composite layup schedules, hull calculations, wave load tables, and hand-drawn cross-sections of boats that had survived things boats were not supposed to survive. She left a box of old composite samples, small squares of fiberglass, carbon fiber, and Kevlar laminate that she had kept the way other people kept photographs. She left the drafting pencil worn flat on one side. Mara drove home with the notebooks on the passenger seat and the pencil in her shirt pocket. She parked on the lot and sat in the truck and did not go inside the pod for an hour. When she finally entered, Iris was asleep on the bunk. The vent stack drew air through the shell in a sound so quiet it was almost silence. Something had been in the world that was no longer in the world, and the absence had a weight that settled into the curved walls and stayed. Sakufran. The secondary crisis came 4 months after Nomi's death, during a workshop on a Saturday in October. A squall line moved across the panhandle faster than the forecast predicted. The sky changed from overcast to green-black in 20 minutes. The weather radio issued a tornado warning for Caligo County at 2:14 in the afternoon. At 2:17, straight-line winds hit Heron Cut at 65 miles per hour. 14 people were on Mara's lot when the warning sounded. 3 families, Lena, Daryl, and 2 volunteers from the County Emergency Management Office who had come to observe the clinic. The conventional shed where Mara stored chairs and supplies lost its window on the north side. Glass blew inward. A 12-year-old boy named Cole Paget, the same family whose insulin Mara had cooled after Meridian, took a shard across his upper arm. The cut was deep enough to see muscle. The boy screamed once and then went silent, which was worse. Mara had 14 people, 1 injured child, no hospital within reach, and a pod designed for 2. She did not freeze. She moved in the sequence Nomi had made her rehearse. She opened the pod's door and the egress hatch to create a flow path. She cleared the central aisle. She strapped the battery cabinet down. She sent Daryl to the truck for the first aid kit and the emergency supplies she kept in a sealed bin behind the seat. She told Lena to get the people inside, children first, seated along the walls, no one standing, no one near the hatches. 7 adults and 7 children fit inside the pod. The fit was not comfortable, it was survivable, bodies pressed against the curved walls. Cole Paget sat on the galley counter with his father pressing a towel to the arm wound. Mara used the hand crank ventilation fan because with 14 people breathing in a sealed space, the carbon dioxide would build faster than the passive stack could clear. She cranked with her right hand, the wrist that had never fully healed, and felt the elastic bandage soak through with sweat. Every 10 cranks, she checked Cole. The towel was red, but the bleeding was slowing. The cut needed stitches, not a tourniquet. She told Cole's father to maintain pressure and elevate. The straight-line winds lasted 9 minutes. The pod vibrated. The people inside were quiet in the way people are quiet when they are held inside a sound they do not understand, the low, continuous hum of the shell negotiating force. A woman named Pam held her daughter's ears. Daryl stood by the door with his back braced against the frame, not because the door needed holding, but because he needed to hold something. When it passed, Mara opened the door. The shed's north window was gone. A folding chair had traveled 40 feet and embedded its legs in the sand. Lena's produce stand sign had blown down. No one on the lot was seriously hurt except Cole, who was driven to the clinic in Panama City by his father and received 11 stitches and a tetanus booster. The crisis was small compared to Meridian, but it tested the innovation differently. Not just the shell's ability to resist wind, but the pod's ability to hold frightened people, manage air, accommodate an injury, and function as a community shelter under pressure. The blade had been designed for 1 woman and a child. It had just held 14 people because the woman who designed it had learned from a naval architect that the shape does half the work and the habits do the rest. Troy Pallison saw opportunity where Mara saw responsibility. 3 weeks after the squall line, Troy began posting photographs on Facebook. The photographs showed decommissioned turbine blade sections, 3 of them, acquired from the same scrapyard north of Panama City, staged on concrete blocks on a vacant lot behind Pallison Salvage. No saddles, no helical piles, no through-bolted bands, no rubber isolation pads, just white composite shells sitting on blocks with hand-painted signs that read, hurricane tube homes, storm-proof living, inquire within. The posts got attention. A local news blog ran a short piece. A real estate investor from Destin called Troy about buying 3 units. A family from the Low Road asked Troy how much it would cost to put one on their lot. Mara saw the photographs on her phone while sitting in the pod with Iris doing homework on the fold-down table. She stared at the screen for a long time. The blade sections were sitting loose on blocks. No anchoring, no load path, no engineering of any kind. In a storm, those shells would not shelter anyone. They would roll. They would become debris. They would become the thing that killed the people inside them or the people nearby. She drove to Pallison Salvage the next morning. Troy was standing beside one of the display blades with a tape measure and a man in a polo shirt who was taking notes on a tablet. Mara parked and walked to Troy without greeting the visitor. "You are selling the shape without the load path," she said. Troy's jaw tightened. "I'm selling affordable storm shelters, same as what you built. What I built is bolted through steel to piles sunk 7 feet into the ground. What you're selling is a tube sitting on blocks. In 60-mile-per-hour winds, those blocks will kick out and the shell will roll. In a 100-mile-per-hour wind, the shell will travel. You know what a 6,000-pound composite projectile does to a neighborhood?" The man in the polo shirt lowered his tablet. Troy stepped closer. "You do not own the idea of living in a tube, Mara. I do not want to own it. I want you to anchor it. I want you to engineer the connections. I want you to protect the openings instead of cutting holes wherever it is convenient. I want you to do it right or not do it." Troy said, "I will do it how I see fit. Then people will die and it will be your name on the sign." The man in the polo shirt left without buying anything. Troy watched him go and turned back to Mara with the kind of anger that comes from knowing you have been caught and resenting the person who caught you. Daryl arrived the following Monday. He had seen the Facebook posts. He inspected Troy's display blades and found them in violation of 4 county codes. No foundation engineering, no anchoring to resist overturning loads, no permitted occupancy pathway, and unpermitted commercial signage on a residential zoned lot. He issued stop work notices on all 3 units. Troy tore the notices off the blades and threw them in the dirt. Daryl picked them up, dusted them off, and said, "Tear them up if you want. The violations are in the system. You will not sell these until they are engineered, and you will not engineer them until someone who knows what they are doing draws the plans." Troy looked past Daryl at Mara, who was standing by her truck at the road. She had not followed Daryl onto the lot. She did not need to. The code was doing the work now, but the damage was already spreading. 3 families had already asked Troy about buying unanchored blades. A contractor in Port St. Joe had posted Troy's photographs with the caption, "The future of affordable housing." The idea was loose in the world now, the visible shape without the invisible discipline, and Mara could not chase every copy. The danger was specific and measurable. An unanchored blade section weighing 6,000 pounds, sitting on concrete blocks, would begin sliding at sustained winds of 45 miles per hour. At 60 miles per hour, the blocks would kick and the shell would roll. At 80 miles per hour, a rolling shell would travel. Florida produced winds above 60 miles per hour in ordinary summer thunderstorms. Troy was not selling shelter. He was selling the conditions for a catastrophe that would carry Mara's name because people would call it a turbine blade house, regardless of who built it wrong. She drove home and sat in the pod and opened Nomi's notebook to the page labeled "Second Shell." At the bottom, in Nomi's handwriting, was a sentence Mara had not noticed before. "The object is never the lesson is always the force." Mara closed the notebook. She knew what she had to do next, and she knew Nomi would not be there to help her do it. The storm clinics were not enough. Teaching people one Saturday at a time was not enough. If the idea was loose, The discipline had to travel with it. She needed something that could outlast her Saturday mornings on a half-acre lot, something that could reach the people Troy had already confused, and the people who would confuse themselves next. She picked up Nomi's drafting pencil and turned to a blank page. At the top she wrote 2 words, load path. Below it she began to draw. The notebook page that said load path at the top filled slowly over the following weeks. Mara wrote in the evenings after Iris fell asleep, sitting at the fold-down table with Nomi's drafting pencil and a clip-on LED light clamped to the structural rib above her head. She was not writing a book. She was writing a method, a sequence anyone could follow to harden an existing home against wind, regardless of what the home was made of or how much money the owner had. The sequence had 7 steps. She numbered them because Nomi had taught her that people remember numbers better than paragraphs, and because the number 7 fit on one page. 1. Walk the roof. Find every lifted edge, every popped nail, every gap where flashing meets shingle. These are the places wind enters first. 2. Check the connections. Follow the load from the roof sheathing to the trusses, from the trusses to the wall plate, from the wall plate to the studs, from the studs to the foundation. If any connection relies on gravity instead of metal, it will fail. 3. Protect the openings. Every window and every door is a breach point. Cover them or shutter them or accept that once they break, the house is no longer a shelter. 4. Secure loose objects. Everything outside the house that is not bolted down becomes a projectile. Patio furniture, trash cans, roofing sheets stacked against a wall. Move them or anchor them. 5. Elevate critical systems. Medications, batteries, documents, water. Everything that cannot survive flooding must be stored above the highest watermark you can imagine, then 6 inches higher. 6. Know the air. A sealed house traps heat and moisture. An open house lets wind destroy the envelope. Ventilation must work in both directions, enough to breathe, not enough to breach. 7. Practice the shutdown. Walk through the sequence before you need it. Check every step. Time yourself. The storm will not wait for you to remember. Mara typed the 7 steps on a single sheet of paper using the library computer in Heron Cut. She printed 50 copies. She handed them out at the next storm clinic. Dennis Crowder took 3 and gave 2 to his neighbors. Grace Ochoa laminated hers and taped it inside her garage door. Lena pinned 1 above the register at the produce stand. The single page became the thing that traveled farthest. Mara had not named it. The community named it for her. People called it Mara's 7 Things That Must Not Be Loose. The name was not quite accurate. The list was about more than loose objects, but it stuck because it sounded like something a person would say, not something a government agency would print. The nonprofit came together the way things come together, when no one has money, but everyone has labor and the memory of what it felt like to watch their roof leave. Mara, Daryl, and Lena filed the paperwork for a small workshop organization in January, 4 months after the squall line crisis. They called it Load Path House, not because they built houses, because they taught people the principle that held houses together. Daryl handled the code compliance side. He had spent his career enforcing standards that people resented, and now he had a chance to teach the reasoning behind the standards instead of just the penalties for violating them. He brought his clipboard to every workshop and used it as a prop, holding it up and saying, "This clipboard does not protect your house. Your connections protect your house. This clipboard just tells me whether you did the work." Lena handled the people. She knew every family on County Road 41 and 3 roads beyond. She knew who had money and who did not, who would accept help, and who would rather lose a roof than admit they needed a hand. She drove her truck to houses that had visible damage and knocked on doors and said, "Mara is holding a clinic Saturday. Come if you want. bring your photographs. She never said come if you need to. She said come if you want. The distinction mattered. Mara handled the teaching. She had been afraid she could not do it without Nomi. The first workshop after Nomi's death, she stood in front of 11 people and opened the second shell notebook, and her voice cracked on the second sentence. She closed the notebook. She picked up a piece of scrap plywood and a box of nails and drove a nail through the plywood into a 2x4 and then pulled sideways on the plywood until the nail bent and the plywood separated. "That is what happens to your roof," she said. Then she drove a screw through the same plywood into the same 2x4 and pulled again. The screw held. The plywood cracked before the connection failed. "That is what should happen to your roof," she said. "The material fails before the connection does. If the connection fails first, you do not have a roof. You have a lid." The 11 people understood. They understood because Mara showed them instead of told them. The way Nomi had shown her, the way her father had shown her. The knowledge moved through demonstration, not lecture, through hands, not slides. The workshops grew. By the second month, Mara was running 2 sessions per Saturday, a morning session on wind hardening and an afternoon session on water intrusion. Daryl inspected participants' work the following week and issued informal report cards. Lena tracked which houses had been hardened and which had not on a hand-drawn map pinned to the wall of her trailer. By the end of the first year, more than 60 families had attended at least one workshop. 14 of those families had completed the full 7-step hardening sequence on their homes. The cost per home averaged between $110 and $340 in materials depending on the size of the house and the condition of the existing roof. That number, $110 to $340, was the number Mara repeated at every workshop because it was the answer to the question Troy had been asking wrong. The question was not how much a hurricane shelter cost. The question was how much it cost to keep the shelter you already had. Troy Pallison's unanchored display blades sat behind Pallison's salvage through the winter, gathering algae and county violation notices. He did not remove them. He did not anchor them. He left them on their concrete blocks as a statement, a refusal to accept that Mara or Daryl or the county had the right to tell him what he could do with industrial scrap on his own property. The thunderstorm that answered him came in March. Not a hurricane, not a tropical system, a garden-variety Gulf thunderstorm with embedded cells and a microburst that produced straight-line winds measured at 71 miles per hour at the Heron Cut Marina anemometer. The first display blade shifted at 50 miles per hour. The concrete blocks beneath it cracked along their hollow cores, and the shell slid 18 inches to the south, grinding a white arc into the gravel. The second blade tipped at 58 miles per hour. It rolled off its blocks with a sound like a dumpster being dragged across asphalt and came to rest against Troy's chain-link fence, bowing the posts inward. The third blade, the largest, the one Troy had photographed for his Facebook posts, the one with the hand-painted sign still wired to its root ring, rolled completely off the pad at 63 miles per hour. It traveled 41 feet across the gravel lot, crushed the south section of Troy's own fence flat to the ground, crossed the drainage ditch and came to rest in the scrub palmetto on the county right-of-way with the sign facing the road. No one was hurt. The lot was empty because Troy had gone home before the storm, but the damage was visible from the road, and the road was County Road 41, and everyone who drove past the next morning saw the white composite shell lying in the ditch like a beached whale with the words Hurricane Tube Homes, Storm-Proof Living, facing skyward in Troy's hand-painted capitals. 63 miles per hour. Not even tropical storm force. The blades had rolled in a thunderstorm that did not merit a name. Mara's pod, 4 miles north on the same road, had not moved a quarter inch in those same winds. The difference was not the blades. The difference was the saddles, the piles, the bolts, the bands, the witness marks. The difference was the system that Troy had looked at and decided was optional. The county cited Troy for allowing an unpermitted structure to become debris on public right-of-way. The fine was $800. The crane rental to move the blade out of the ditch was $1,200. The fence replacement was another $900. Troy spent $2,900 proving that Mara had been right, and the proof was lying in the palmetto for anyone to see. The humiliation was precise. The community did not laugh at him the way he had laughed at Mara. They did something worse. They said nothing. They drove past and looked and said nothing. And the silence was heavier than any mockery because it contained the memory of everything Troy had said about the woman who moved into a dead airplane wing. Troy arrived at the next Saturday clinic 3 weeks later. He did not announce himself. He did not apologize. He stood at the back of the group of 19 people and listened to Mara explain how to inspect a ridge vent. He stayed for both sessions. When the afternoon session ended and people were folding chairs, he walked to the pod and looked at the steel saddles and the helical pile caps and the witness marks on the bolts. Mara was coiling an extension cord 10 feet away. She saw him but did not approach. Troy said, "What would it cost to do one right?" Mara set the cord down. She walked to where he stood. She said, "The first cost is admitting the blade is not the shelter. The system is." Troy looked at the ground. He looked at the witness marks. He said, "How much for the system?" Mara told him. Helical piles, steel saddles, through bolted bands, rubber isolation pads, reinforced openings, protected ventilation, witness marks on every connection. She gave him the same numbers Nomi had given her, adjusted for current material costs. She did not inflate them, and she did not discount them. She treated him as a customer with a question, not an enemy with a debt. Troy left without committing. He came back the following Saturday, and the Saturday after that. On his fourth visit, he brought a tape measure and a notebook and asked Darrell to walk him through the county permit requirements for an accessory shelter structure. The conversion was not dramatic. It was erosional. Troy did not have a moment of revelation. He had a series of Saturdays during which the weight of evidence became heavier than the weight of pride. The first Saturday, he stood at the back and said nothing. The second Saturday, he asked one question about bolt torque specifications and wrote down the answer. The third Saturday, he brought a photograph of his remaining blade section and asked Mara to identify the structural ribs. The fourth Saturday, he brought a tape measure and a notebook and asked Darrell to walk him through the county permit requirements for an accessory shelter structure. Each Saturday cost him something. The men at the marina noticed. One of them asked Troy why he was attending the woman's classes. Troy said, "Because my fence is still flat and her tube is still standing, and I would rather learn from someone who is right than keep being someone who is wrong." The man did not ask again. By summer, he had hired a welder to fabricate saddles for his remaining blade section, the one that had not rolled bars, and paid Ray Purvis to install helical piles on the Pallison salvage lot. Darrell inspected the anchoring and found it adequate. Not excellent. Adequate. Which was, for Troy, a beginning. Jonah Reed appeared for the first time during Meridian, though Mara did not notice him then. He was a lineman for the Regional Power Cooperative and a volunteer rescue worker who spent the 72 hours after landfall cutting fallen trees off roads, reconnecting downed service lines, and pulling debris out of drainage culverts so the flooding would not get worse than the wind had already made it. He was 39. He was quiet in the way that people who work with electricity are quiet, careful with his hands, aware of what he could not see, and respectful of forces that would kill him without malice. He came to the lot 3 weeks after Meridian, not for the clinic. He came because a power line spur ran along the edge of Mara's property, and he needed to inspect the pole for storm damage. He parked his cooperative truck and walked the pole and checked the insulators, and then stood looking at the white blade in its saddles for a long time. Mara was inside the pod sealing the replaced hatch. She came out when she heard the truck and saw a man in a hard hat and high-visibility vest standing with his hands in his pockets, reading the witness marks on the saddle bolts without touching them. "You painted alignment marks on every bolt," he said. "Yes. That is what we do on substation connections. It is what my mentor taught me." He nodded. He introduced himself. He told her the pole was sound. He left. He came back a week later with a spool of 10-gauge wire and an offer to run a proper grounding system from the pod to a copper rod he would drive himself, because a composite shell on a sand ridge in Florida without a lightning ground was a bet against statistics that would eventually lose. He did not charge for the labor. He said the cooperative had donated the wire. Mara let him do the work. She watched him drive the ground rod with a sledgehammer, 8 feet of copper sinking into wet sand in measured strokes. Each one the same force, the same angle, the same follow-through. He worked the way she worked, precisely, without wasted motion, without performance. He came back a third time to fix the squeak in the storm hatch. Iris had mentioned it at the produce stand while buying tomatoes from Lena, and Lena had mentioned it to Jonah during a power line inspection near the stand. The chain of information was indirect enough that Mara could not accuse anyone of matchmaking, but she noticed that Lena smiled when Jonah's truck appeared. The hatch had squeaked since Meridian. A pin in the hinge had been slightly bent by debris impact, and the misalignment produced a sound like a bird chirping every time the wind shifted the hatch in its frame. Mara had lived with the squeak because fixing it meant disassembling the hinge, straightening the pin, and reassembling in sequence. A 2-person job that she had not asked anyone to help with because asking for help with a squeaky hinge felt like admitting she could not do everything alone. Jonah disassembled the hinge in 4 minutes, straightened the pin over the edge of the steel saddle with 2 precise taps of a ball-peen hammer, and reassembled it in 3 minutes. The hatch closed in silence. Iris, who had been reading on the bunk, looked up and said, "It stopped." Jonah said, "That is the idea." Iris trusted him before Mara did. Children read competence differently than adults. They do not need credentials or explanations. They need the squeak to stop, and the person who stopped it to not make a speech about it. Jonah made no speeches. He came when there was work. He left when the work was done. He brought materials he said were donated, and labor he said was free, and the quiet confidence of a man who understood that Mara's pod was not a project he was rescuing, but a structure he was respecting. The courtship happened through labor. They replaced the cracked solar panel bracket together on a Saturday afternoon, Jonah holding the welded steel while Mara drilled new mounting holes. They strung a shade canopy between the pod and the slash pines using marine rope and turnbuckles, creating a covered outdoor space where the clinics could expand beyond the pod's shadow. They carried Nomi's drafting table from the truck bed into the pod together, setting it in the taper section where the light through the porthole-style vent fell across the surface in the afternoons. One evening after a workshop, Jonah stayed to help Mara stack folding chairs. The last chair went into the storage shed, and they stood in the doorway with the Gulf light going amber behind the pines. Mara said, "You do not have to keep finding reasons to come here." Jonah looked at her. "I'm not finding reasons. The reasons keep showing up." The grounding rod was a reason. The hatch was a reason. The chairs are not a reason. The chairs are a reason if you need help stacking chairs. Mara almost smiled. She said, "I do not need help stacking chairs." "I know," Jonah said. "That is why I like helping." It was not a declaration. It was an understanding. 2 people who communicated through work recognizing that the work had become something else, without either of them changing what they did. The labor was the language. The competence was the trust. Everything that mattered between them had already been said with a torque wrench and a ball-peen hammer. The commitment came on an evening in September, a year after Meridian. Jonah was sitting on the steel saddle with Mara, while Iris did homework inside. The Gulf light was the color of copper. The slash pines had regrown their crowns, and the shadows were longer than they had been the year before. Jonah asked where his tools should go if he stayed. Mara pointed to the taper storage bay. "Nothing loose," she said. "Everything strapped." He understood that this was not a rule. It was a language: safety, order, readiness, the way she held the world together. He nodded and went home and came back the next morning with a toolbox and a duffel bag and set them both in the taper bay, strapped down with cargo webbing, next to Nomi's notebooks and the box of composite samples. The years compress the way years do when the crisis is over and the work becomes daily instead of desperate. Mara and Jonah built a small code-compliant house beside the pod the following spring. It was not large. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen that shared a wall with the original concrete pad. Daryl inspected every connection, every truss tie, every window anchor, every ridge vent nail. He used ring shank throughout and told Mara it was the first house he had inspected in 30 years where he did not find a single deficiency. When he signed the occupancy permit, he stood in the kitchen doorway and said, "You know the difference between this house and the pod? This one has right angles. I am more comfortable with right angles." Mara said, "I know. That is why I built it with right angles. So you would sign it." The pod became Mara's workshop. She kept the bunk for emergencies. Iris still crawled into it during severe weather warnings, trusting the curved walls the way she had trusted them the first night. But the galley counter became a workbench, and the fold-down table became a drafting surface, and the taper section became the archive where Nomi's notebooks lived next to Mara's growing collection of field reports from hardened homes across Caligo County. She added improvements to the pod over the years, the way a sailor adds fittings to a boat that has proven itself. An exterior sacrificial debris rail, a strip of replaceable aluminum channel bolted to the windward side that would absorb impacts and protect the composite shell beneath it, laminated storm-rated glazing to replace the cracked marine hatch, alignment marks on every new fastener, a hand-drawn cross-section of the full anchoring system, rendered by Nomi's pencil and Mara's hand, taped to the interior wall where every workshop visitor could see the invisible work that held the visible shell in place. Iris grew the way children grow when the ground beneath them stops shifting. She went from drawing floor plans on scrap cardboard to drawing them on graph paper to drawing them in a CAD program at the county library. She entered the science fair in 10th grade with a project titled Continuous Connections, a comparison of fastener types under lateral loading. She won 2nd place. She was furious about the second, which Mara took as a sign of inheritance. At 16, Iris helped teach a load path house workshop for the first time. She stood in front of 23 people and demonstrated the nail versus screw test that Mara had used at the first solo clinic after Nomi's death. She used the same 2x4. She used the same scrap plywood. When the plywood cracked before the screw failed, she said, "The material failed before the connection. That means the connection was doing its job." The phrasing was Mara's. The voice was her own. Mara watched from the back of the group and felt something she did not have a word for. Not pride exactly, and not relief, but the specific sensation of watching a load transfer cleanly from one structure to the next. Iris enrolled in mechanical engineering at the State University. She hated being used as proof in other people's speeches, the girl who lived in a wind turbine blade, but she kept Nomi's drafting pencil on her desk in her dorm room, the flat side worn smooth from use, and she did not explain it to anyone who asked. Load Path House continued because the storms continued. Every June, Mara ran a preseason clinic. Every September, she ran a lessons learned session. The workshops had spread beyond Heron Cut to 4 neighboring towns. The first real test of the hardened homes came during Tropical Storm Arlette the following August. Arlette was not a hurricane. It was a disorganized tropical storm with sustained winds of 55 miles per hour and gusts above 70. It hit Caligo County on a Friday night and left by Saturday morning, a minor event by Gulf Coast standards, but minor events were where the data lived. Of the 14 homes that had completed the full 7-step sequence, not one lost a shingle. Not one had a window breach. Not one reported water intrusion through a sealed opening. Grace Ochoa's plywood shutters deployed in 17 minutes, 3 minutes faster than her practice run, and her 6 windows survived without a scratch. Dennis Crowder's ring shank ridge vent nails held while 2 neighboring houses with smooth shank nails lost their ridge caps in the same gust field. Of the homes that had not been hardened, 9 reported some level of roof damage. 3 lost window glass. 1 family, the Guthries on County Road 38, lost their porch awning, which tore free and struck their truck hard enough to crack the windshield. Mrs. Guthrie attended the next storm clinic and completed all 7 steps within 2 weeks. The data was small. 14 homes was not a study. But the comparison was visible on the same streets, in the same wind field, under the same rain, and the visible was what changed minds. People did not need a research paper. They needed to see their neighbor's roof intact next to their own missing shingles. They needed the number, $110 to $340. They needed to know that the gap between their roof and the wind was not money or luck, but 36 ring shank nails in a Saturday afternoon. Darrell retired from the county and became a full-time volunteer instructor, teaching code reasoning with the same clipboard he had carried for 30 years. He gave the clipboard to Mara as a retirement joke. She hung it on the wall of the pod next to Nomi's notebooks and the original inspection notice from the county that had started everything with the words, "Dwelling application denied." Lena's produce stand reopened after Meridian with a curved white awning, cut from an unusable blade tip that Mara had shaped and mounted on a steel frame. It was the only produce stand on County Road 41 with an aerodynamic roof. Lena told every customer the story of the awning, and the story always ended with the same line. Strange is not the same as stupid. More than 200 families attended Mara's workshops over 5 years. Only a handful ever lived inside converted turbine blade sections. The idea required too much specialized knowledge and too specific a set of conditions to become a mass solution. That had always been the point. The lesson was never the blade. The lesson was the load path. Troy's final acknowledgement came during a storm preparation day 3 years after Meridian. The county had organized a community hardening event, and Troy had volunteered to help anchor a newly approved accessory shelter on a lot 2 miles south of Heron Cut. The shelter was a blade section, engineered, permitted, and inspected, installed for a family that had lost their storage building during Meridian. Troy was on his knees with a torque wrench, tightening a saddle bolt. A young volunteer stood beside him, watching. "Do not skip that," Troy said, pointing to the witness mark paint that the volunteer had not yet applied. "That is the part that keeps it from becoming trash again." Mara was 30 feet away, reviewing the pile cap measurements with Darrell. She heard Troy's voice carry across the lot. She did not turn around. She did not need to. The conversion was complete because Troy was teaching her principle in his own words to someone who had never heard of Mara Velez, and he was teaching it as if it were his own. That was not theft. That was legacy. Whoa. In the 5 years after Meridian, more than 200 families attended Load Path House workshops. 14 converted turbine blade sections became legal accessory shelters across 3 counties after engineering review. But the real measure was smaller and harder to count. The number of roofs that did not peel, the number of windows that did not breach, the number of families who knew where the medicine was before the first advisory. Before every hurricane season, children at Iris's old elementary school were sent home with a single laminated page, Mara's 7 Things That Must Not Be Loose. Mara lived on the same half-acre off County Road 41. The pod eventually became her workshop, then her archive, then the place she went when she needed to think in curves instead of right angles. She never removed the original witness marks from the steel saddles. Iris once asked why. Mara said, "Because the marks tell the truth without improving the story." On the wall inside, next to the clipboard and the notebooks and the denied permit, she hung the drafting pencil worn flat on one side. Below it, in Nomi's handwriting on a card from the notebook. The object is never the lesson. The lesson is always the force. Years later, during the first advisory of another hurricane season, Mara walked the length of the blade at dusk with a wrench in one hand. She checked each saddle bolt by touch, the way her father had taught her to check composite panels, the way Nomi had taught her to read a structure with her hands instead of her assumptions. Inside, the pod glowed warm through the recessed hatch. The wind lifted pine needles across the sand, searching for something loose. Troy Pallison had once leaned against the bait freezer and said, "She bought herself a dead airplane wing and called it a house." The freezer had floated sideways in Meridian surge water. Troy's shed had folded flat. The white blade still rested in its saddles, held by steel, held by piles sunk 7 feet into the earth, held by the witness marks that had never broken their lines. Mara set the wrench on the saddle and pressed her palm flat against the shell. It was warm from the day. It was smooth. It was strong. The wind moved across the ridge and found nothing to hold on to and kept going.